I'm going to go, any of you who have been following our series know, since we're back in Genesis, we were up in Acts, Romans last week. Obviously, I'm going off our series, sort of. This last Sunday, I brought a message on Lot's wife, and in the process of studying, studied on this passage a little bit and felt God kind of leading me here. So the focus is still going to be on choices, but way, way off the order of where we are in our series and looking at it just a little bit differently this evening, I believe. So Genesis chapter 13, I'm going to start reading in verse 1. And Abraham, or excuse me, I'm try that again since 2 words in and I already messed it up. And Abram went up out of Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him into the south. And Abram was very rich in cattle, in silver, and in gold. And he went on his journeys from the south, even to Bethel, unto the place where his tent had been at the beginning between Bethel and Hai, unto the place of the altar which he had made there at the first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord, and Lot also, which went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. And the land was not able to bear them, that they might dwell together, for their substance was great, so that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdmen of Abram's cattle and the herdmen of Lot's cattle, and the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelled in the land. And Abram said unto Lot, Let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, between thy herdmen and my herdmen and thy herdmen, for we be brethren. Is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me. If thou wilt take the left hand, then I will go to the right, or if thou wilt depart to the right hand, then I will go to the left. And Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zoar. Then Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves the one from the other. And Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent toward Sodom. But the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. And we'll go ahead and stop there for right now. Let's have a word of prayer. Lord, I want to thank you for this evening, Lord, the time we can be in your house, and the time that we can be in your word tonight. Lord, I do pray that you will speak through me tonight, Lord. I pray that you will help me and my inabilities to not get in the way of your word and the way that you want to speak to us tonight. Lord, I pray this in your name. Amen. You can go ahead and be seated. Like I said, staying with our series on choices, but looking at it just a little bit differently and off track a little bit as far as where we're at in the timeline. This is a rhetorical question. Don't raise your hand, because every one of us in here would have to if we're honest. Who in here has ever made a decision, maybe that you thought was a good decision, only to realize later that was a really bad decision? My guess is that every one of us in here at one time or another has done something that we made this decision what we were going to do. And again, maybe we thought this is the right thing to do, or we thought this was a good choice to make. And then after the decision, realized that was a mistake. That was a poor choice. That can be to varying degrees. Sometimes we make poor choices in decisions, and it's just a small thing. I'll give a personal example. I tend to be one of those people, when I go to a restaurant, I find something that I like at that restaurant, and I don't vary much from it. Just the way I am. This last week, we went to El Toro on Sunday, and I ordered myself some chorizo street tacos, because if I go to a Mexican restaurant, that's what I'm going to order every single time, because I love chorizo street tacos. I know it doesn't matter what Mexican restaurant I go to. If I order those, I'm going to be happy. Just the way it is. I'm just one of those people. I have my favorites, and I don't tend to stray very far from those. But every now and then, I'll go to a restaurant, and I'll decide, I'm going to be adventurous today, and I'm going to try something new. And normally, they have those pictures, and I go saying, I'm going to get chorizo street tacos. And then you look at the picture and think, but boy, that looks good. is why I go to a Mexican restaurant. I don't even open the menu because I know they all have chorizo street tacos. Don't tempt me with pictures because the pictures always look really good. So I order it, and then I set it down and immediately think, I wish I had street tacos. I made a mistake. You know, some mistakes and poor choices are little things like that. They're really, you know, don't amount to much. Others are a whole lot larger. Again, a personal example. I worked with a guy for some time whose name was Dave, and I've told of Dave in here before. We lovingly referred to Dave as Crazy Dave because he had some major anger issues, and I'm not going to go into all the personal history of it, but when I worked with him, he had just got out of prison for his anger issues. And for some reason, as an 18, 19-year-old guy, I thought that was funny, that he was just out of prison for anger issues, and I thought it was equally funny that when I picked on him, it drove those anger issues. And I will never forget the day that I started joking with Dave, and he got angry enough that he picked up his hammer and started chasing me around the house we were building, swinging his hammer at me. I made a decision to pick on him and very quickly realized that was a mistake. 18, 19 years old, I wasn't super smart. It didn't stop me from picking on him in the future. I just made sure I had enough distance and a head start of a run that he wasn't going to catch me. But to, you know, mistakes can be to varying degrees. Some are small, some are a whole lot larger. Poor choices that we make often have varying degrees. They often have varying reasons. There are some poor choices that we make that are simply because maybe we were misinformed or uninformed. You know, something that maybe I thought I knew, so I made a choice, and then afterwards realized I didn't know. Or maybe I had no idea, but some sort of choice had to be made, so I made one. Anyone who drives has dealt with that. You're driving along and you're faced with the decision of, you know, you have to turn one way or the other, and you don't know, and you don't see a sign, and there's, you know, maybe no one else in the car, or for me it always seems like everyone else in the car is sleeping when you get to that turn that you don't know where you're going. And you have to go somewhere, so you just turn the way that makes sense, and oops, it's the wrong way. Basically, every time I'm in a roundabout, those things always mess me up. Or we could use the example of you choose maybe a job because it looks good, and then you get into it and realize, boy, I didn't research that enough. Years ago, I did this when I was doing mostly new construction, that I met a contractor who had a project that he wanted me to sign a contract on to do for him, and I was young and excited for consistent work, so I signed a contract with him and did the work, and then he refused to pay. It wasn't until after that I looked into him and found out he has a history of doing this. I made a decision to work with him without being informed, and it bit me. Sometimes that's what our poor choices are. It's simply a matter of we made a mistake because we didn't know. We weren't informed. Other times, our poor choices are intentional. We know the potential downsides, and we know that there may be consequences, but it's what we want to do, so we're going to do it anyway. You know, it's just, we know that this is a mistake, but it's what I'm going to do, so I'm going to do it anyways. I'm not sure why, but it often seems that when people need help moving heavy things, I get a phone call. I drive a truck and don't mind breaking my back, so I get that call. So a few years ago, a friend asked me to come help him move his gun safe, just he and I. And I don't know, you know, if all of you know, they are extremely heavy. I was not uninformed. I knew exactly how heavy it was. It had a label right on it that said 565 pounds. I knew. I knew it wasn't going to be light. And I have multiple times. This was not the first time I've got that phone call saying, I need to move a gun safe. Will you come help me? This was not, you know, a brand new thing. And I knew this gun safe was big enough. This probably shouldn't be two guys. However, knowing the potential consequences, we chose to do it anyways. And I know it's a a relatively small thing, but you get the idea that sometimes our poor choices, we make them, we know the consequences, we know that it's the wrong choice, but we choose to do it anyways. But not only do poor choices have varying degrees and varying reasons, they have varying timelines. And I'm almost to the message. We're getting through the intro here. They have varying timelines. All poor choices, and I want to make sure to stress this, and I'll mention it again later in the message, all poor choices have consequences. They all do. You aren't going to get around that. When you choose to do the wrong thing, it will always cost something. But sometimes when it costs varies. Some poor choices, you see the result immediately. That the moment you make that choice, you see the consequences. There are other times that we make poor choices and we don't see the consequences for years. We don't see the results of them for a very long time. I have a good friend who this happened to, and it's been years ago now, but he made a lot of poor choices regarding his family and his marriage, and it seemed like it wasn't going to be an issue, and somewhere down the road he realized his marriage was ruined. The consequences took years. A lot of times to a point that we think, well, maybe I've gotten away with it. A lot of times the consequences will take long enough that we think, well, God hasn't punished me yet, so maybe he's just going to let me slide. Now, I say all of this about poor choices to get us all on the same page because I have zero doubt that we can all relate to this in one way or another. We've all been there, that we've made poor choices. We've all been in a position of realizing, boy, that was a mistake, and I'm sure that we've all at one time or another had to pay for that mistake. I want to bring our focus back to the passage. Looking at Lot, who made some pretty major choices, which had some major consequences. But here's what I want us to focus on. Lot made some poor choices. I want us to focus on what led to him making those poor choices. What led to that? First thing I want us to see, Lot left God out of the decision. Lot had a major choice here that he had to make, and he left God completely out of the decision. Look at chapter 13, verse 10 and 11 with me again. Starting verse 10, Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zoar. Look at this next, the start of verse 11, this next few words. Then Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan. Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves the one from the other. Lot chose him. Here is Lot making what's going to be a life-changing decision. To this point in his life, Lot has grown up with Abram, and when God tells Abram to go, when he has Abram move, tells him to go, it isn't a question that Lot's going with him. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. To me, it's always something interesting when you read your Bible and read the passage where God moves Abram. God doesn't come to Lot and tell Lot, hey, Abram is going and I want you to go with him. God doesn't come to Lot and say, Abram's going and he's going to need you. I want you to go. God doesn't go to Lot and just tell him, hey, I want you to pack up your family and go. Doesn't go to Lot at all. But when Abram is led to go, it was automatic that Lot's coming as well. These two are incredibly close. A relationship that they have, I want to say, is like brothers, except most brothers don't have a relationship as good as these two do. To this point, if you had Abram, by default you had Lot as well, and the two were inseparable. And we see the bind that they have throughout this, that even when... I'm not going to have us turn there, but even when not together, later on, Abram fights for Lot. Because these two are close. And now that was about to change. He's about to make a decision that would completely change his life by separating he and Abram. And we don't know, the Bible doesn't give us a whole lot of insight to Lot's relationship with God. But based on a few factors, that we have to believe that he had some sort of relationship with God. I mean, for one, the Bible calls him just Lot. There aren't a lot of people that you would say are just. More than that, there aren't a lot of people that the Bible calls just. So you've got that. You have when the Lord is coming to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, he includes Lot among the righteous that are in the city. Remember the debate between Abram and God about would God destroy the city if there is 10 righteous in the city? One of those times that Abram is fighting for Lot, as he's arguing with God, would you destroy the city for 10 righteous? And God sends an angel who goes straight to Lot. He's counted among the righteous that are in the city. And if nothing else, being as close as he was to Abram, he would have been a witness to the relationship that Abram had with God. So I think we have to assume that he had at least some sort of relationship with God, and yet when faced with what would have been this life-altering decision, God was nowhere in his decision. Again, verse 11 says it very plainly that he chose him. He chose what he wanted. He chose what looked good to his eyes and what was pleasing to him. We don't see Lot asking God. We don't see Lot offering a sacrifice or anything like that. We see none of that. Lot looked at what looked best to him and made this decision completely off of himself. And we like to look down on Lot for that, and understandably so. He made a huge mistake. But I think before we get too fast to point the finger, we better take a look in the mirror first. Because it's very often that we are guilty of exactly the same thing. That we have some major decision to make, and we look at what's going to affect me and what looks good to me, and leave God completely out. Some examples. Maybe a new job opportunity. Very often, Pastor and I hear people, getting a new job that's going to take them out of church, but they can justify that it's better pay and it's better benefits and it's better all of this, and of course God would want me to have better pay and better benefits, so that I can better provide for my family. But they never, of course God would want this, but they never actually ask him. They never actually spend time in prayer over it or seeking that it's really what he wants for their life. They're just deciding for God what God wants. Or the example of a move that we think, well, this just seems right. I mean, everything is better. That's what Lot faced. It was well watered. I mean, think about this. Quite literally, what Lot did was looked and said, the grass actually is greener over there. It's well watered. We often do the same. That things look good there, so it must be right. And we leave God out of the decision. There are a lot of areas that we could mention with that. Those are only a few, but we're often guilty of the same mistake that Lot made, making what amount to huge decisions in our life, whatever they may be, and leaving God out of it, choosing what looks right to us. I find it amazing. God wants to be a part of our decision making, but he won't force himself in. God won't stand over you. God didn't stand over Lot and tell me you better make the right choice or else. He wants to be included in your decisions, but you have to allow him. First of all, tonight we see that God was left out of the decision. Second, tonight we see God was pushed out of Lot's home. Turn over with me to Genesis chapter 19. A few chapters over, Genesis chapter 19, verse 12 through 14. Verse 12, and the men said unto Lot, hast thou here any besides son-in-laws and thy sons and thy daughters, and whatsoever thou hast in the city, bring them out of this place, for we will destroy this place, because the cry of them is waxing great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. And Lot went out and spake unto his sons-in-laws, which married his daughters, and said, Up, get you out of this place, for the Lord will destroy this city. But he seemed as one that mocked unto his sons-in-law. Story is familiar enough. I'm not going to have us read all the in-between and all of it, but we know the progression that Lot took, that he chose the plain where we started in Genesis 13. He chose the plains, what looked good to him and was pleasant to the eye, and then as he went to the plain, the Bible tells us that he pitched his tent looking toward Sodom, and the next thing we know, he is in the city, and it appears that his progression didn't take very long. We aren't talking about years and years and years going by from the decision to take the plain to being in the city. And more than just in the city, he's a respected member of the city, which are all steps taking God more and more and more out of their home. At the risk of getting kind of ahead of myself, I want to add this now. That always is how it happens. No one jumps straight from a close relationship with God to pushing him completely out of their home. It's a progression, one little step at a time. Then one step leads to one more step, which leads to one more step, which leads to one more step, and further and further. Looking at Lot, the verse that we just read in chapter 19, shows the extent that he's reached. This passage to me, Genesis chapter 19, these verses, 12 through 14 especially, to me is incredibly sad. When you think of the extent that he's reached, Lot tells him, get his family together because God's going to destroy the city, and they need to leave, and Lot goes to his sons-in-law, and they laugh. Lot tells them, this is what God said to me, and their reaction was they laughed, which tells you a few things about where God was in their home. It tells me that God wasn't mentioned very often in their home. Sunday, I mentioned the message from years ago to the teens about the pile of rocks, the children setting up a memorial, and the reason behind it being they could rehearse to their children what God had done, and doing that shows their kids the way that God rescued them, and shows their kids how powerful God is. It shows their kids that God cares and is involved. But obviously that wasn't happening in Lot's house, because these boys didn't believe that God could or would do it. God wasn't mentioned in their home. It tells me that God was more of a joke than a coming Messiah. It tells me that God wasn't personal. Perhaps this was Uncle Abraham's God. They were close, God and Abraham. It was between them. And the longer he spent separated from Abram, the closer he got to the world's influence, the further he pushed God out of his home. Which I think begs the obvious question tonight: where is he in your home? We could look at the same three things. Is God mentioned in your home, or is that just a church thing? That's true in many quote-unquote Christian homes today, that they come to church and they talk about God, and then they go home and they put their Bibles away and they don't mention him again until the next time they go to head to church. They don't spend time with God. They don't mention him in their home. You've got a joke in your home. I know the Wednesday night crowd automatic reaction is, no, of course not. But really? Because if we say, well, I trust God to answer prayer, and then we really don't trust him to answer our prayers, isn't that making him a joke? I can't help but wonder, and this might sound harsh, and if so, I apologize. I can't help but wonder if sometimes we say we're going to trust God, and our children or our coworkers or our spouse are laughing inside because they know, no, they're not. They say they are. No, they're not. Because they know he says that when it really comes down to it, he's not going to trust God. He's going to find his own. And again, I know that sounds harsh, but I think sometimes we need to take a harsh look at ourselves. Is he a joke in our home? Is it personal, or is it just your pastor's faith, your spouse's faith, for kids? Is it just your parents' faith? It cannot be someone else's faith. It has to be your faith. Personal. In the passage, we see God was left out of the decision. God pushed out of the home. Third point kind of takes a little bit of a different direction. Despite God being left out of the decision, despite God being pushed out of their home, we see God was still in the solution. Look at chapter 19, verse 15 through 17 with me. It says, "And when the morning arose, then the angels hastened Lot, saying, Arise, take thy wife and thy 2 daughters, which are here, lest thou be consumed in the iniquity of the city. And while he lingered, the men laid hold upon his hand, and upon the hand of his wife, and upon the hand of his 2 daughters, the Lord being merciful unto him. And they brought him forth, and set him without the city. And it came to pass, when they had brought them forth abroad, that he said, Escape for thy life, look not behind thee, neither stay thou in the plain, escape to the mountain, lest thou be consumed." And it goes on from there. That gives us enough for right now. Now, let's think about this for just a moment. Lot has walked away from God. Lot is given the choice of where he wants to go, and he chooses himself rather than God. He leaves God entirely out of his decision. Then he pushes God out of his home so much so that when he tells his kids that God is speaking to him and what God's going to do, they think, well, Dad must just be joking. And yet after all that, when the time comes that Lot needs help getting out of the mess that he has created with his own decisions, God is still there. God doesn't say, you made the mess, now live with it. Figure it out yourself. You left me out of this decision process, now leave me out of the solution. That's something we would do. Thankfully, that's not something God did. That's something we would do, that, someone excludes us from the decision and they want, no part of us, but then the minute they're in trouble, they give you a call. That's typically the person that you're like, ignore. I don't need to answer that phone call. We tell them things like, well, you made your bed, now you can lie in it. That's not what God does. Again, that doesn't mean you're going to be exempt from punishment, but when Lot needed to be rescued from his own mess, God was there with the solution. God was there to not only tell him to gather his family and leave, and not only there to tell him, hey, it's time to leave right now, but when Lot continued to linger, God was there to grab him by the hand and drag him out. Because while Lot may have chosen a way that seemed like it was walking away from God, and Lot may have been pushing God out of his home and out of his family and out of his life, God had never left. He was still there. Still ready to rescue. For the Christian here tonight, that same thing is true, that we may make decisions that exclude God. And we may sometimes choose a path that takes us away from God, and we may even choose by the way that we live sometimes to push him out of our homes and out of our family. That does not mean that God has gone anywhere. He's still right there, ready to help you out of the mess that you've created. Doesn't mean there won't be consequences. It doesn't mean there isn't still a price for your decisions, but it does mean you don't have to face them alone. It does mean you don't have to face them alone. I'm going to prepare to conclude the message this evening. I want to quickly apply this in this way. Learn from the mistakes of Lot. I mean, it's pretty simple. Learn from the mistakes of Lot. Learn to not only include God in your decisions, but to make your decisions based on him. Because there is a difference. There is a difference between between including God in your decisions and making your decisions based on Him. There's a difference between asking someone's opinion and saying, I'm going to do whatever you say. For instance, there would be a huge difference if I asked Zach, what do you want to do tomorrow? And if I told Zach, whatever you want to do tomorrow, sky's the limit, no expense too big, no thing too difficult, whatever you want, that's what we're going to do. There's a big difference between those two things. If I just ask his opinion of what would you like to do tomorrow and give him total freedom of whatever you want, that's what we're doing. It's a big difference. With him, there's no telling what we would end up doing. There's a big difference there. There's a difference in taking God into consideration in your choices and following whatever He tells me to do. There's a big difference there. Let God lead. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 tells us, trust in the Lord with all thine heart, lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct thy paths. That's the difference between taking God's opinion into account and letting Him lead. It comes down to trusting Him. The difference comes down to learning that I can't rely on my own decisions, and I can't rely on my own thoughts. I have to rely on Him. And learn to fully lean on Him to direct me. Let God lead. Applying in that way, applying and keeping God in your home. Not just Sundays, but every day. Making ways that you can talk about God with your family on a regular basis. Making ways that your kids can see that God is more than just a Sunday and Wednesday thing, but an everyday thing. Personally, I want God in my home every day. But that doesn't just happen. You have to make a choice. Learn from Lot's mistakes to avoid making mistakes. Lord, I pray that you will, Lord, help us to grasp this. It really is a sad thing when you look at Lot, who, growing up with